Good evening. I'm Venki Ramakrishnan, the current president of the Royal Society, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to what I hope will be the first of conversations between scientists and people from the arts and humanities to discuss broader issues of science and society. Tonight, our guest is Stephen Fry. We all know him as a great actor. He's appeared on many television programs on the big screen. I myself, who grew up with P.G. Wodehouse and Oscar Wilde and enjoyed his portrayal in Jeeves and Wooster and in the movie Wilde. He's also a widely read author who's written on a broad range of subjects, ranging from humor to autobiography, and most recently about Greek mythology. And some of you may know him as something of a polymath if you've seen him on QI, but he's here today for none of those reasons. It is because he's a non-scientist with a deep interest in science and rationality and has engaged in conversation and debate with many leading thinkers, including Steven Pinker and Richard Dawkins. And that is one of the reasons that we really wanted him to appear on this program. He's also consistently argued against superstition and pseudoscience. This brings me to the state of science today. Science is among the most trusted of professions. And today, science is more in the news than ever. Yet there's also widespread misinformation fueled by the growth of internet and social media. Many question both the motives and the conclusions of science and promulgate all sorts of nonsense, ranging from the barely plausible to the outrightly bizarre. So it'd be nice to talk about the nature of science, how to combat misinformation, and how to build and maintain the trust that science has in society. So welcome, Stephen.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Venki. It's a real honor to be here. It truly is. The Royal Society stands for something very enormous in our culture. And while I know I'll never be a fellow, I don't have what it takes. I don't have the chops, but it is something to be under its aegis just for an hour.
Thank you, Stephen. So let's begin with the nature of science. I think many people, when they think about following the science or the scientific method, have a slight misconception. Scientists know that there isn't such a thing as the scientific method. There's no magical recipe. Rather, there are a variety of methods with different kinds of evidence, some of which may be stronger and some not as strong. And I was wondering how you, as someone interested in science, perceives science.
It's very hard to find an all-encompassing definition. You're absolutely right. In terms of method, I suppose one can talk about experimental science and therefore look at the difference between rationalism and empiricism, as the philosophers used to describe these two ways of approaching the truth. One by what you might call pure reason, which is the equivalent of if you like, non-experimental physics or pure mathematics, things that have no application in the real world, but are abstracted and yet can be used to discover extraordinary truths. And I personally have always loved empiricism. I've loved, it's a very strong part of the British age of reason and enlightenment, was that it was always palliated. The reason was always palliated by experiment. I like to think that, you have, this is extreme, and you'll forgive me if you're French, but as a kind of image, you have a Pascal figure who has a piece of paper and numbers, and he has a theory of light, which is purely rational. And you have Newton, who takes a piece of cardboard and punches a hole in it and looks to see. And that is a very crude way of describing a difference in thinking, but it's one that has always struck me as desperately important. And the way they both come together because they can seem to be very opposing, and it's often used in a psychological way to describe two utterly different character types, a rationalist and an empiricist. And rationalism can often be superstitious. It can often be something that works purely on its own outside the world, and empiricism tends to call it out. In that sense, comedy is empirical and tragedy is rational, if that isn't an absurd way of looking at it. You know, the comic spirit is always to test things on the anvil of experience. And characters like Hamlet, you know, just talk about ideas and things without ever really having the common grounded sense. But I would say the two come together in my definition of science, which is humility before the facts.
Yes, I think that since this is a Royal Society event, it's interesting to point out that one of the strengths of the Royal Society was that it came down on this idea that it doesn't matter how beautiful a theory is or how important the person who proposed the theory, but you know, its motto is nullius in verba, which is on nobody's word. It's the evidence that matters. And I think that restored a very healthy balance between rationality and empiricism, and allowed modern science to flourish so that you didn't have this imbalance, as you know, that's another way you might look at it.
Yes, and the part of me that can't help but be interested in drama and novel and personality, perhaps even over ideas, or at least who can only grasp ideas when they're mediated by personality, looks at a story like Ignaz Semmelweis. I was filming in Hungary, and I was able to go and find an Ignaz Semmelweis museum in Buda, on the Buda side of Budapest. And he had long been a hero of mine because he was a true tragic victim of empiricism in the face of cruel rationalism. I'm sure you know the story. It's a very important one in the history of medicine, but most of us know the story of John Snow, who you know, locked the pump in Soho and proved that the miasma theory was wrong. And that was a great step forward, again, of empirical behavior. But Semmelweis was a youngish figure who was faced with this terrible problem of women in parturition dying of sepsis. Really appalling numbers of them died in childbirth, and they were being delivered by medical students, but they were being the babies were being delivered by medical students who had come straight from the dissecting room without washing their hands. But this is before germ theory. To us, it seems so automatically grotesque an idea, but nobody had thought that might be in any way a connection. And indeed, Semmelweis didn't particularly. He tried all kinds of closed off experiments, not exactly, you know, random double blind trials, but as close to it as he could do. He controlled things. And one of them was to get a certain number of a cohort of these students to wash their hands. And immediately the deaths went down. You and I won't be surprised to hear. But the awful thing was, he suggested that there was something on their hands that was causing these deaths. And because microscopy and Pasteur and Koch and germ theory hadn't yet arrived in the world, this was considered insane. And he was laughed to scorn, sacked, ended his life in an insane asylum. I mean, it was a really dreadful story. And he couldn't have been more right. And it seems to us extraordinary that because there was no evidence that these little invisible things existed, except the fantastic evidence of the drop in the death rate, its reason defeated epidemiology in an awful way. And you know, I think of that as not as an example of the arrogance of the existing science because they didn't accept it, but just of the split nature of the human way of looking at things. In a way, we won't accept something that doesn't make sense to us, even if there is hard evidence, it seems.
Yeah. A very similar thing happened in the late 19th century when Boltzmann, you know, the famous physicist, great proponent of the atomic theory, but he was surrounded by people who thought the atomic theory was just a fiction, just a matter of, it was something the chemists just used as a convenience, had no basis in reality, people like Ernst Mach. And he was really hounded for quite some time before the community realized that he was right and rallied around him. He committed suicide, but that was for other reasons. He was mentally ill.
Yes.
But he did face a lot of trouble. But it does go to show you that rationality and empiricism, they have to go hand in hand, because empiricism without an underlying conceptual framework isn't going to get you very far. For example, you may know the death rates drop, but unless you know the underlying basis, you can't go forward.
Exactly. You stumble on the distinction between a correlation and a causality.
Exactly. But so they're both important. But what's interesting from your example is that they're not always in sync. Sometimes one leaps ahead and the other has to catch up.
But there are very romantic stories when they are in sync, like Eddington going off to Africa.
Exactly. I was just about to say about the bending of light, and of course, you could argue we're still testing some of the predictions of relativity, for example, gravitational waves 100 years later. So sometimes they're well out of sync, and sometimes, as you pointed out in that beautiful example of the Eddington expedition, they can be quite closely in sync.
Yes.
So I want to come to another issue about science, which is uncertainty. So scientists always live with uncertainty. And doubt, as you know, is an intrinsic part of science. I'm reminded of a well-known senator who once ran for president named Edmund Muskie, who said that on his committees, he only wanted one-armed scientists because they kept saying, on the other hand, and they could never give him a straight answer. And Naomi Oreskes, the author of Merchants of Doubt, has pointed out how this very natural doubt that exists in science has been exploited by people like the tobacco lobby or the fossil fuel lobby to argue against conclusions that are widely accepted by the science community.
Absolutely right.
And in a recent debate, you, Stephen, have argued against being too certain and for passionate and positive doubt. Those are your words. And you also said, just because science doesn't know everything doesn't mean it knows nothing.
Yes, that's right. Because that's one of the maddening things when you're having an argument with someone who is doubting science and doubting a stack of evidence. When it comes to almost anything, they will say, well, science doesn't know everything, as if that's to say that it allows them to push open against science in every degree. Say, well, no, it doesn't know everything, but it knows a lot more than anything else knows. After all, science, the origin of the word science is knowledge, scire, the Latin for to know. It is about establishing what you can know, and like any good philosopher, any good scientist realizes there are limits to what you can know, but they're nothing like big enough limits to allow all kinds of nonsense to be said. And it is one of the great worries that I was quoting, I think, in that debate, Bertrand Russell, who said it is one of the sad things in the world that those people, who know a lot and think a lot are filled with doubt, and those people who are foolish are certain. And it's been refined in some ways into the now very well-known Dunning-Kruger effect, for example, that the very nature of mental and cognitive incompetence is that it can't encompass its own incompetence. It doesn't know how stupid it is. The problem with stupid people is they don't know they're stupid. And smart people know the limitations of their smartness. So that allows bloviated braggarts and diehards like the American president to behave as if they know everything when they know less than the smallest and meanest educated person knows, but they are not in any way inhibited by an understanding of their lack of understanding, if you see what I mean, which is deeply worrying. And then on top of that, there is a cynical layer of quite able people who, as in the case of this, I forget her name, you quoted her, who I heard recently on the radio, talking about the similarity, the congruence of the tobacco playbook and the fossil fuel playbook, that exactly the same way of muddying the waters, of hiring somebody in white coats. In fact, I think the tobacco industry called it their Operation White Coat. Was the name of their first move in the 50s, as it became apparent that smoking was, the evidence was mounting up and up and up and up. They called it Operation White Coat. Just get someone in a white coat whom you can pay, and tell them that it is uncertain, that it's not quite clear yet. The evidence isn't all in. The jury is still out. And you can say this again and again about anything. And at the moment, of course, it's being said about climate change and the anthropogenic nature of climate change in particular. Because people will look at the medieval warm period and say, see, there are cycles. And once you have to stop and go into the detail, once you have to go, as the popular phrase is, granular, people are bored. They don't want to know anymore. They just like hearing the big rhetorical statements. And in the 1950s and 60s, when C.P. Snow and F.R. Leavis had the famous two cultures debate, humanities versus science, as if they were, enemies, and that there were two ways of looking at the world, and one was correct and truthful and valuable, and the other wasn't. And to Leavis, the scientific method was cold, calculating. It controlled human beings. It wasn't human-shaped. It was abstracted, and it led to dark forces and dark outcomes, whereas the literary and artistic way of trying to examine human impulse, human feeling, and looking at that through the lens of an artist was something that only gave joy. They're both sides exaggerated, naturally. I think we've got beyond that two cultures approach. But nonetheless, there is still out there in the world a feeling that you can simultaneously appropriate science and dismiss it. So you use the word uncertainty, and of course that's a kind of double meaning in post new physics language, because you think of Heisenberg, and so you can say, look, even quantum physics says the world is uncertain, which is a total misreading of what that's supposed to mean.
Yes.
And indeed, uncertainty is probably not the best translation.
No.
But nonetheless, that's the word that's stuck. And so people say, and look at chaos physics. There are nonlinear equations. Everything's turbulent and unknowable. So science is really proving that science isn't of any use. And yet the most ridiculous fraud selling crystals and so on will use words like frequency and energy, which are words that have a very specific meaning in physics, of course, and we'll use them of crystals and if you wanted to go and say, when you talk about this frequency this crystal is giving out, they say, yes, I mean, do you remember your quartz watch telling the time? That was giving out a frequency. Yes. Does this mean that if I take a piece of rock and rub it, and they're so slippery, aren't they? They're so
co-opting of scientific jargon in contexts where they have absolutely no meaning. This is something that scientists really, I think, despise. But the real problem, getting back to uncertainty and doubt, is how to convey to the public that doubt and uncertainty are always a part of science, but it doesn't mean that we don't know anything.
Yes.
It's
theory doesn't mean that something is unsettled. The theory of people, for example, creationists will say, well, it's just a theory. Well, no, that's obvious nonsense.
That's the other thing. Theory as meaning something hypothetical, whereas we think of theory as a conceptual framework.
Exactly.
And so I think that is, so there are a number of issues. I'm not sure that I'm not sure how to make headway on this doubt problem. And I think it is important. We're facing it, for example, now with climate change, but as I'll come to later, it's also coming across with COVID, various aspects of the pandemic and so on. And one thing is that eventually the truth wins out.
Mm.
No one now questions whether smoking causes cancer.
No.
And despite years of sort of pushback. And so the question is, how do we sort of accelerate that process? In other words, how do we, mount an attack against the people who are, obstructionists or really actually in some ways somewhat dishonest about their claims?
Well, part of it is that if someone has an axe to grind or a political agenda to put forward, they are nearly always able to use rhetoric in order to put their point forward and to humiliate and to discredit their opponents. So, for example, in politics, if someone won't change their mind, they're stubborn. But if you like them, they show immense stability. And so if you disliked Margaret Thatcher in the old days, you would say she was stubborn and she just wouldn't change her mind. She was like a donkey, just stuck there, wouldn't change. And others would say what you like about Maggie, she sticks to her guns. So that's just an obvious example of how you use language. And similarly, scientists, if people want to discredit a science, then scientists are either arrogant because they state something as a fact, and they're just arrogant, white-coated technocrats, or if a scientist is kind of, as it were, makes the rhetorical mistake of being humble, then they can just simply get trampled over. So really, it's about recognizing who the enemy is of the truth at any particular time. And obviously, we have serious enemies of the truth when it comes to medical science at the moment, which is something we're all thinking about in terms of the anti-vax movement, if you can call it a movement, and the idea that, vaccination is a hoax, that COVID is a hoax, and that the epidemiological and virological ways of trying to explain it are hoaxes. But there are sciences that are halfway sciences. They're not pseudosciences, but they're sciences that take a long time to be accepted as sciences, in the same way that subjects get a long time sometimes to be accepted into universities. Like economics took a long time before anybody would call it a science or a study or a discipline. And one of the sciences nobody's talking about much at the moment, but which I know from friends in court, as it were, does have seats on SAGE and other committees, and therefore has the ear of government, is not virology, it's not epidemiology or medical science generally, biology or chemistry or anything like that. It's a science that we don't really think much of at the moment. It was discredited in the 60s or late 70s perhaps, and that's behavioral science of one kind or another. Now, what do we mean by behavioral science? Is it a mix of psychology, and is it that kind of conditioning science of B.F. Skinner that, involved mice in, but as long ago as Sherlock Holmes in his in the second novel, A Sign of Four, he says rather brilliantly, Watson, it's one of the most extraordinary mysteries that scientists can predict to an extraordinary order of precision how a mass of people will behave, how the average human will behave under certain circumstances. But nobody can predict what an individual is going to do. Yeah, and that is one of the subjects that behaviorology has to try and look at.
Yeah,
it is a mistake.
That's a very interesting point.
I mean, when you're in theatre, for example, and you're in a reasonably successful show, you know that on Monday, you'll sell between 40 and 50% of the tickets. On Tuesday, it'll be 60%. On Wednesday, 80%. And then Thursday, Friday, Saturday, you'll sell out. Well, why is it that those individuals, some of whom go on a Monday, why don't the 40% who go on a Monday, why don't 4 weeks worth of them all go on one Monday and it sell out hugely. And yet the averages do work out of individual humans who are all captains of their soul with their own brains and decisions. They act in predictable ways, and yet individuals don't. Anyway, the point is,
companies know this
yes,
well. Facebook and other companies know very well exactly how we will behave on average, and advertising agencies.
There's a lot of money at stake in this kind of science. And as we know now, to behaviorology and psychology has been added in the past 20 years, game theory and all kinds of ways of modeling nudging and behavior and so on, which have been used in financial markets as well as in things like Facebook, as you rightly say, in order to predict human behavior and to nudge it, not just to predict it, but to some extent to control it. And this leaks over into politics, as we also now know, thanks to Cambridge Analytica and the Russian behavior and other interferences in the ways people vote and think about subjects like who's going to be American president, or should we not stay in Europe. And here a mixture of prediction and nudging and human control has been used for enormous profit, either political profit or massive financial profit.
Yeah, and that brings me sort of to the next topic I wanted to bring up, which is misinformation in today's world. When the tobacco company did its lobbying efforts, there was no internet. But today, we have the internet, we have the growth of social media, and it's a double-edged sword. I mean, children growing up in India or Africa can have access to the world's knowledge at their fingertips. But it's also fueled the growth of misinformation. You mentioned QAnon. QAnon has acquired amazing followings, even among Republicans.
There's going to be a Congress. Exactly.
So on. Yep. And many of these people, and there are all sorts of conspiracy theories. You take something like COVID-19. It's a remarkable testament to the power of science. Just weeks after the outbreak, people discovered the cause of the virus, and then they not only discovered the virus, but they were able to sequence it. They were able to get a test for it. They were able to identify modes of transmission and how to suppress it. They're on their way to trying to obtain vaccines and drugs. When you compare that to HIV 40 years ago, that progress that we've had in less than a year took almost a decade.
Yes.
And so, science has done tremendously in this pandemic. Absolutely. But there are people
I would say as a gay man who lost lots of friends that actually the HIV epidemic was instrumental in improving virology and epidemiology in incredible ways to do.
Absolutely. And we're reaping the benefit. We're reaping the benefit of that. But nevertheless, you hear all these crazy theories about COVID-19, such as the whole virus is a hoax. It was artificially developed by China, or alternatively by Bill Gates. Or it was developed by the pharmaceutical industry because they want you to get sick so they can sell you things. And by the way, 5G makes you susceptible to this virus. And so we must destroy 5G infrastructure. This all strikes, to an average scientist, this strikes us as crazy. And there's now a significant minority of people, the anti-vaxxers you mentioned, who say that, if a vaccine comes along, we don't trust it, we're not going to take it. And so I wonder what you think, first of all, what is your reaction to this? And what do you think we could even do about it?
Well, my reaction, as I suppose most people's ought to be, one hopes would be, is obviously horror and a sinking heart every time I pick up my iPad in the morning, which I keep stupidly by my bed and really shouldn't, and I look at the news. By the time I'm on my feet and ready for a shower, there's already hot lead leaking into my stomach as I think of just the horror of the world. But I would suggest this, Venki, that Science, are you familiar with the idea of Stephen Jay Gould's NOMI, his non-overlapping magisteria, as he put it? He was the son of a rabbi, and it hit him very hard to try to be, when science was aggressive towards religion and claims that religion made. And he suggested that there should be non-overlapping magisteria, which is just a grand word for realms of inquiry, for areas of thought. In other words, science should stick to what science was good at, and human, whether you call it the humanities or the liberal arts or whatever culture you come from, those sort of things and religion can look after things that science shouldn't look after. But I think, and a lot of scientists thought he was a bit nuts about that, and that it wasn't right. And I agree that he wasn't right, partly because science has decided that it's not its job to look at things in the human world, I mean, apart from the human body, but it looks at things that are of nature, essentially. Physis, the Greek word is, and so every scientist is really a physicist. They're looking at physis, they're looking at the laws of nature, either in terms of biology and botany and geology, even the planet and the cosmos, and the laws of motion and everything else that seem to cause the whole thing to work in the way that it does. But that human interaction and human behavior, generally speaking, is a subject for non-scientists. Well, the problem is that a huge number of very clever non-scientists fill that space and are therefore able to pull triggers on human beings that they've discovered, the kind of triggers that Daniel Kahneman, who won his Nobel Prize for identifying in his excellent book, the cognitive biases, the salience biases, all the biases to which we humans are prey to, and of which we are mostly unconscious, and of which are two kinds of mind that he Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow was the book that kind of hit the popular presses and made him a dinner party chatterer hero. But there's a lot of extraordinary work that he did that shows that science can look at how people believe and why they believe, and why they can be pushed into believing things that are untrue, and why they find it hard to accept things that they don't want to be true. And all this is deeply important and is as subject to a rigorous scientific codification and explanation and a laying out as is the reason that leaves go red in October.
Yeah, this is the growth of behavioral science.
That's right.
And
so I think that is part of it. I think scientists can't hold back and say, gosh, look how stupid humans are. They're not believing us. They should say, some scientists should say, we've done a lot of work on this. We know why humans are being like this, and that should be open science. And in a sense, that is happening, but maybe there's more to it. It should.
Yeah, I think, your hero, Bertrand Russell, whom you mentioned, used to talk about the infancy of reason. And the idea is that, we all have a thin veneer of rationality, but deep down, we're actually quite emotional beings.
Yes.
And we come to conclusions often based on emotion, and then we try to justify it with reasoning or rationality after the fact.
Absolutely.
So we make a choice or form an opinion, and then try to sort of rationalize it later.
And a very popular science now, of course, is evolutionary psychology. And that would say that we're right to be the way we are, because we've evolved to need to respond very, very fast to danger, threat, or the possibility of a big lunch. And reason takes too long. If emotion can short circuit the journey between problem and solution, then take it.
Yes. So it leads to a question. So, when scientists argue about the evidence or data, they often, as you say, come across as cold and logical.
Yeah.
A bit like Spock,
exactly.
or in the worst case, Dr. Strangelove.
Yes.
And so Naomi Oreskes, the person who wrote Merchants of Doubt, has come out with a new book called Why Trust Science. And she points out that maybe scientists really should in order to connect with people, expose their humanity, that scientists are not individually, we try to be objective, but as individuals, we fail to be objective. Science is objective because of the entire process of science, of keeping each other in check and providing sort of scrutiny by the community. But as individuals, we're human beings. We have egos, we have different motivations.
You're also subject to the pressures of academia and industry and whoever is sponsoring.
Exactly. And she felt that if we were more sort of forthcoming about ourselves and our humanity and our motivation, we would come across as more authentic. Do you?
Yes. Funnily enough, I was going to come to exactly this point. It's as absurd for scientists to talk about the science and scientists as it would be for historians to talk about the history and historians as if they were a special class. And historians are just people who have looked further into history than most. And the history makes no sense at all. I'm following the history. Well, whose history? What are your sources? What, and the science, of course, must irritate scientists every time they hear a politician saying the science. But you can see why politicians do. And because politicians are human as well. And scientists, yes, are human. They have 2 nipples and 2 legs, or they might have more. It's occasionally possible to have more than 2 nipples, of course, but you know what I mean. The point is we're all subject to the same pressures and thoughts and desires and guilts and complexities. And one of the things that scientists, just as people in the literary and the humanitarian and the humanities need to be more aware of science, so scientists need to be more aware of the humanities. And I think all scientists should, for example, read Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, where he sets out very beautifully how the Greeks understood this. You talk about Mr. Spock in Star Trek, and of course, he said what the Greeks understood so clearly about themselves as this rather new civilization that had done remarkable things was that they were split between 2 principles that their own mythology gave them names for, the Apollonian and the Dionysian. In other words, Apollo, the god of reason and prophecy and truth-telling, the golden Apollo. They saw that as part of being Greek. They had given them the world music and rhetoric and logic and mathematics, all kinds of advances in those subjects. But also Dionysus, who was a god of frenzy and addiction and desire and letting go of your feeling and appetite, and that they were just as much Dionysian as they were Apollonian. And their tragedies, their plays, very often played out the contradictions in themselves between this. And if we think that the truth, either the human truth or even the truth of the world, can be expressed by a human being who is exempt from these contradictions, these pulls in his own or her own personality, then they're fooling themselves, because scientists desire things too. I become rather obsessed by the story of Franz Haber, which you probably know is one of the most extraordinary stories of a scientist, and I think acts as a story that covers all of science. And he was a Nobel Prize winner because you could argue, was responsible for saving more lives and causing more people to be born than any human who ever existed. He was the man.
The estimate is the world's population would be about half what it is now without the Haber process.
Because of his ability to the way he found it to get nitrogen available for farmers and so on. Before, they'd have to get guano from South America and bones from boneyards in order to try and get the nitrogen into the soil and increase the fertility of their crops and so on. And then, as you say, he's responsible for that. But then in the First World War, as a good German, he was also responsible for chlorine gas. For the gas attacks. He actually supervised them and went to the front and taught the men how to use the wind best in order. And he watched as French soldiers were shooting themselves in the head to commit suicide.
Quite horrible.
In order to stop the foulness of this burning in their throat. And his wife who
committed
was a
suicide.
brilliant,
Yeah.
yes, she was a brilliant chemist herself, and she went out and shot herself because she was so ashamed and horrified by what her husband had done, who then went on after the First World War to produce this amazing new, I suppose it complemented the nitrogen, weed killer type poison that they called Cyclone, which in German, of course, is Cyclone. And it turned out that, of course, was the poison that the SS used in the death camps to kill Haber's family.
That's right. The irony is he was Jewish,
Exactly.
and he did not want to leave Nazi Germany. He said, "I'm a loyal German, and you must, accept that."
Yeah.
It
And he
shows
didn't
you.
even stop then. His legacy is still there because the Monsanto company used the same chemical that was in Cyclone for Roundup and for the, and it is, I don't know if you've seen, what's that documentary on Netflix? It's a very good one about the soil and about the history of the degradation of the soil in the United States from the Dust Bowl onwards. And so there's an example of the fact that you cannot possibly, you cannot possibly take science as a pure thing. It's as everyone knows, it's application. And a pure scientist will say, oh, but that doesn't apply to me because I'm not a technologist or an engineer or working for a factory making some product. I'm not wet science. I'm blackboard or, whiteboard or whatever it is now, but that doesn't quite wash, does it?
No. And it's actually the Haber anecdote you mentioned. It is actually a lesson that scientists also must learn not to have the sort of arrogance of science, because science has been so successful and is such a very logical way of looking at nature and the world. We mustn't forget the sort of human aspect of why we do science and what it means. I think that's very important.
Yes, I mean, if one wanted to start again with universities, I think, clearly ethics has become more and more important a subject, both in business and in science. Bioethics is obviously a very rewarding field, a very important field as we move towards this tsunami of new technologies which we are facing, which we haven't been able to speak about yet, but that's one of the huge problems. And maybe we can learn from history that something scientists have never been very good at doing in the larger sense is prediction. They can predict events, discrete events that are part of their scientific realm, and that is the prediction and repeatability of phenomena is part of what makes science work. It's part of the proof of science, of course. But if Galvano and Volta and Coulomb and Faraday and Thomson and Maxwell, if they had all predicted what the effect of their beautiful theories and their wonderful science, their marvelous mathematical modeling of this strange force, this electricity that was also seemed to be magnetism and yes, was both. And if they could see that as a result of that, would come technologies that would so transform the world, and in some cases so impoverish areas of it as well as enriching others. I wonder what they would have said, because how great their minds were and how logical the outcomes of electronics came, as you move all the way up through to the Bell Labs and Shockley and the transistor and these extraordinary developments. And then, of course, computing, and right up now to the possibility of quantum computing. And
I think Faraday, though, did have an inkling, because I forget whether it was the Prime Minister or the Queen Victoria, who asked him, "What good is this?" And he said something to the effect that, well, one day you may tax it. Of course, he may not have, he may not have realized that the tax could be in the trillions, but anyway. So,
very true.
But getting back to the trust question, part of the problem is that some of the sort of things that people argue about, like the anti-vaxxers, well, an anti-MMR paper was published in a mainstream journal, okay, before it was retracted.
Oh, Andrew Wakefield, you mean?
Exactly.
Yes.
And similarly, there was a paper on GM crops, which also turned out to be flawed. There have been data on whether high tension wires cause cancer. Each of these cases, there's been an initial finding. That finding has turned out to be flawed. Subsequently, lots of papers have discredited the finding, and yet the original flawed paper seems to live on because it was done in this sort of established way, you know, published in a peer-reviewed journal and so on. And so I think the public doesn't understand that there's a provisional nature of science. You could have a finding, and that finding could turn out to be wrong, and subsequent findings, you know, is the mass of evidence which people believe in. And it's very, very hard because there are often scientists, there's often a small group of scientists who will still insist that the original finding was correct. There are still scientists who argue that cold fusion is correct, even though, you know, it's been widely discredited. So I sometimes wonder how to tackle that problem and how to sort of restore faith in the consensus, trust in the consensus. And part of the problem is people will argue, oh, well, you know, Galileo was against the consensus, and the consensus,
yes, exactly.
you know, or quantum mechanics. And they don't realize that these are very, very rare, and that is why we remember them. They're revolutionary. And that is not how science works most of the time.
There's also a misunderstanding that people think the next generation of science overturns the previous one, that somehow Einstein disproved Newton.
Right.
You know, and that Niels Bohr and others disproved Einstein. But when it comes down to it, mathematically, there are differences of almost unimaginably small amounts of decimal places in the results of these two forms of physics. The so-called mechanistic Newtonian one still holds. You can become a millionaire snooker player using only Newtonian mechanics.
Exactly.
Or
design a car, you know, or even a rocket.
Exactly. You can't. Yes, you can get back from on Apollo 13 with a pencil and paper using a few Newtonian equations, as it were. And you certainly can't play quantum billiards, as far as I know, on a table. But nonetheless, yes. So there is this idea that scientists are going to change their minds anyway. That in 50 years' time there'll be another theory along which will disprove the previous one, which is, of course, not what theories mean and not what the history of science teaches us. But it's very hard to kick that out of people's minds. And the other thing is, of course, and this is part of what I said about the Daniel Kahneman business, is that just as we can see the bias in other minds, they can see the bias in ours, or they think they can. So whenever you defend something like an established scientific consensus, people will always instantly want to read a purpose behind you, or big pharma. They'll say, "Oh yes, that's because Big Pharma wanted." Because I mean, I've tried to explain to someone when they said to me, "Of course, yeah, Big Pharma are going to go rub their hands with joy when they find the vaccine." I'll go, "Well, actually, no. They'd probably make more money if there was no vaccine." And over the years, people continued to get ill. The vaccine would actually very soon stop making them much money. So, you know, it just doesn't even. But once you start to argue like that, it's very difficult. And it's not only the arrogance of science, but it seems almost the arrogance of knowledge of history and the ability to lay out an argument are under threat, because populism is all about dismissing elites and experts in all areas, not just science. In fact, science is a pretty safe one compared to those pesky people who've read books and who follow up details and explain truths about things and point out what was said yesterday that you're now contradicting. And as we know, as each month has passed, the populists and their mouthpieces are able to double down more and more in sheer denial and just say, I never said that. And we're now in a position, thanks to deep fakes, which work both ways. Both they can make a politician appear to be snorting cocaine off a prostitute's nipples, who was never near that prostitute, and it looks totally convincing, but also they can allow a politician who really did snort cocaine off a prostitute's nipples to say, that's just a deep fake, I was never there. You know, nothing is stable anymore. Everything.
No, that's a terrible problem.
Yeah.
The kinds of evidence we relied on to establish facts are becoming more and more difficult to sort of convince people.
That's right. They're just part of the culture wars. If you're that kind of person, you believe that evidence. If you're that kind of person, you believe that.
So what do you see as the role of the press? There have been a couple of questions on whether journalists understand the science they're reporting, and are there enough science correspondence, and is the level of debate and reporting been of a high enough standard? And do you think what in general do you feel is the role of the press in all this?
There are, of course, some really good scientific journalists, and we're all the culture owes a debt to Ben Goldacre and Simon Chalmer and people like that who've really increased the general public's understanding of what you might call good science and bad science, fake science and real science, and how to read it. And the BBC has the program which looks at numbers and how they really affect and analyzes and, as it were, fact checks the claims and statistical counterclaims that are made by politicians. And so there is available a much greater access to the truth, but again, you have to want it. And it's very easy for us to say, well, we're what used to be called the chattering classes and now called the sneering metropolitan elite, or whatever you want to call us, and we're unbearable to a lot of people because we pull down these theories, or we want to erect ones they don't like, or we're dishonest, or I don't know. It's very easy to assassinate the character and the process of someone who's your perceived enemy. And I suppose the answer is to try and engage everyone in some element of being part of building a beautiful picture that's true. And a true picture, it's a bit like the old X-ray crystallography. It took a hell of a long time. It took those amazing scientists, most of them women, because men were too flighty to have the concentration skills to do it, to find these different angles and these different presentations of the truth before a whole picture of a protein or whatever could be established. And it was an amazing, of course, now it can be done by machines in seconds, but the point is, if you all felt that you were holding a piece of the jigsaw, and that there was a way that different intelligences and different ways of looking at the world can contribute to, as I say, a kind of modeled, multifaceted truth, it would be very helpful. Because I suppose part of the problem with science, and it certainly is for me, my father was a physicist, and so whenever I asked him a question, his usual instinct was to take a piece of paper and draw a vector, and there was X and there was Y, and there was a sort of wave thing, and on the top of the wave at some point he put X minus 1 in brackets and then squared, and I would immediately say, but I don't understand. I just asked you why the sky was blue or whatever, And he'd say, but don't you see? And there is this enormous gap. And you scientists who are tuned into this Zoom must probably know it's true, but I don't think you understand how stupid we are when it comes to numbers. I mean,
I think I doubt that. I think I'm sorry to say, Stephen, nobody's going to mistake you for being stupid.
I can grasp an idea. I can read a book, but 2 pages later I have to turn back to remind myself.
That happens to, I think that happens to all of us. But I want to get back to this point about people believing what they choose and then automatically trying to discredit the other side. Yeah. And so, if they don't like scientists' opinion or views or data, they will start attacking the scientist. We've seen that even with the pandemic. You know, some of the epidemiologists are harassed
Dr.
on
Fauci,
Twitter.
yes, exactly.
And Fauci, for example, has been really badly, you know, and people are issuing death threats and things like that. And even in Britain, you know, our scientists have often been attacked on Twitter, threatened, etc., and harassed. And so this is a kind of disturbing situation. And the question is, how do you convey to the public that, look, science is what it is, don't shoot the messenger? Is there a way that we can explain the motivations, and perhaps could we be more transparent about the incentives in science? Could we change the incentives in science so that people would trust scientists more? And this might involve a change in the science culture, you know.
It might, and I think that's part of it. And I don't mean that the important questions of science should go unexplored, and that you should reduce the budgets of big science, things like, you know, the Hadron Collider or whatever. They're all obviously immensely important areas of science that one wouldn't, as it were, touch. But in terms of the everyday interface of scientists with others within universities and within industry and within other institutions and establishments and society generally, things have been tried. The chair of the Public Understanding of Science in Oxford, for example, which is a brilliant idea. And unfortunately, and I say this because he's a friend of mine and we have much in common, Richard Dawkins is probably the most famous holder of that chair, but he was a polemical figure and people will always associate him with something. And those who found his, his dismissal of religion in particular, so they found it brittle and angry and ungenerous, perhaps. So that, and I mean this with greatest respect and love of Richard, that in some ways it held back what it was supposed to do, that far from increasing the trust and friendly nature of science, it only seemed to increase the...
It is odd, you know, because in his writings, he comes across as much more strident than he is in person.
In person,
he's very courteous and you know, charming almost.
And he's warm and he's open to the mystery and the wonder of the world, which, you know, he'd be an idiot if he weren't. So the idea that he's a cold rationalist is, of course, nonsense. But it's but one shouldn't sort of rest it all on him in that sense. I think you know, it's been tried when I was a boy and still going on, the Royal Institute Christmas lectures. But, you know, it was always the goody two-shoe Blue Peter watching middle-class children who sat there with their shiny faces laughing and enjoying the experiments that were being shown to them. And somehow something else has got to happen. And I'm trying to, you know, I can't give an answer here and now as to how science is going to be integrated into the public discourse in a way that allows, a reciprocal understanding of science and across cultures and so on. Because, well, one thing I think scientists can do, and that is be better prepared for what is coming. The image I have is we're looking out to sea, which picks up on Newton's idea of being a beachcomber, perhaps. We're looking out to sea, and there are upswells on the horizon of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different complete separate technologies, which are converging into one tsunami. And they are nanotechnology and biotechnology, gene editing, genomics, you know, CRISPR and so on, brain-machine interfacing, quantum computing, new materials, graphene and all the others, and of course artificial intelligence, unsupervised machine learning, and robotics and so on, and bio-augmentation. All these are coming together and are on the horizon, and it won't be long before suddenly that huge tsunami is over us. And each one of these technologies is capable as being as wickedly used for ways that are not good for human polity and comity, if I can use those words, as the internet was or as social media was. But together, the possibilities are terrifying. And I would have said 10 years ago, they are blissful. Look how wonderful it's going to be. But now I'm so doubtful, because the fact that all science and technology can cast a shadow has never been clearer. And often the brighter and better it is, the starker the shadow. That, so I mean, in the late 80s and early 90s, when I joined the internet as almost like a kind of radio ham, it was just an amateur hobby, and Tim Berners-Lee hadn't even invented the World Wide Web yet. And I saw this thing and I imagined how it was going to break down borders and dissolve differences, and it would be a huge university for everybody, a resource, a library, a museum, a theater, a concert hall, a public square. It would be the most wonderful thing that humanity had ever created, and it would end our problems. And at some point, the reverse happened.
Yeah.
And that is and of course I feel stupid, but should I have guessed? Well, I don't remember. I read almost every book on the internet there was to read in the early 90s, which was only about 3 a year. And not one of them said, look out, it's going to be dangerous. Nobody, the dark side.
True.
Well,
and I think it's a lesson that perhaps scientists should not just remain disengaged, but when technologies develop, we have to carry society along. We have to get them involved, get them to understand the technology, and often they will see things that we perhaps in our very narrow technical ways might not. And also what people do with technologies and new science is really a social problem. It's a matter for society to decide, not just for scientists to decide. And perhaps that's the only way we can sort of tackle this tsunami, is by really engaging broadly with the public and bringing them along and dealing with it collectively. I think that's probably going to be more and more needed as these things develop. I mean, genome editing, machine learning, those are two very classic cases where society will have to decide how these things are used, not just the people who develop them.
And of course, we're no longer in the sort of situation that the world was in the 1930s, where Oppenheimer and Einstein could write to the president and inform him of a technology of which he was never aware, and give him the terrible choice as to whether or not to press the green light for it to go ahead and the atom bomb to exist. We all know that CRISPR editing exists. We know that machine learning exists, and we know that there is no locus of authority. There's no equivalent figure who can say, yes, this is a wise thing and we should do it, and no, this is a terrible idea, we mustn't do it, because different nations will do things. There's no consensus around the world. There's no belief in international organizations or the very nature of internationalism. And so, for example, at a university, one might imagine that a solution to such a thing, and you could widen this out, is that in the same way that if I were to write a novel that involved some scientific ideas, I would send the manuscript to the physicist, the biologist, the geneticist, the various disciplines that the book tried to write about, and say, does this make sense? And they would say, it's a bit, no, that's not really how it would be done. And, or yes, that's kind of right, and so on. And similarly, if a scientist has an idea, has made a breakthrough, naturally they publish it and peer review happens and so on. But in the old days, it would be that Hardy and Whitehead or something would go and see Wittgenstein or G.E. Moore or Russell, of course, and say, is there a philosophical, ethical problem with this? Is this a bad idea? And you'd trust a scientist to say, this is what it is, and I can explain it to you. And you'd trust a philosopher to say, you do realize that when people get hold of this, they will want to do that with it, or that it's possible, because most of philosophy these days is what's called consequentialism, isn't it? It's the modern fancy word for utilitarianism, that almost all morality and ethics is predicated on its consequences. Is it, are the consequences good or bad? And that's how you judge morality, not by some external thing like God or conscience, but through consequences. Well, actually, consequentialism should also be put into all scientific breakthroughs and ideas, that the consequences of new ways of thinking, new models and apprehensions of the world, new discoveries, the consequences should be thought through. And I don't mean you can never ban a new thought, or there's never in the history of technology has a new technology not been taken through, and so you can't sit on it, but you can maybe have an element of understanding that it doesn't exist in isolation as a pure scientific model or idea, but that once it's out in the world, just as a pure gas will, it will mix with the atmosphere of the human atmosphere and become something else. And
yeah. Well, this has been a fascinating hour, at least for me, Stephen. So I want to thank you again for agreeing to do this. And I hope those of you who've listened have enjoyed it as much as I have. So thank you, Stephen. And
it's a real pleasure, Venki. And thank you. And thank everybody for tuning in. And good luck, everybody, and keep fighting the good fight for truth and honor and the scientific way.
good night.
Good night, all. Thanks very much indeed. Bye-bye.